Welcome to Cinema of Meaning, the podcast that seeks to explore the depths of what cinema has to offer. My name is Tom, you may know me as the creator of Like Stories of Old, and I'm joined by my fellow video essayist Thomas Flight to talk about Chang-dong's Burning. Before we begin, Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original podcast, meaning that on Nebula you can listen to all of our episodes ad-free and a week early, and you'll also get access to monthly bonus episodes. This exclusive catalog consists of movies such as Fight Club, Babylon, All Quiet on the Western Front, and many more. Be sure to use our personal link in the show notes to get a $20 discount on a yearly subscription. I also want to quickly shout out our Discord server where we discuss movies with our listeners and take the occasional suggestion. If you want to join our little community, the link for that is also in the show notes. Now back to the show. Thomas, Burning is one of the movies that I think your audience has heard you talk about a lot already.
Yes.
In various videos.
I've never made a video specifically about it, but it keeps coming up in various videos.
How so? How does this movie keep coming up again and again for you?
I maybe first mentioned it in my video about subtle performance, highlighting a few moments, Steven Yeun's performance in here, which I think is incredible. Every time I watch this movie, I notice more in his performance that wasn't that I didn't really see before. I think he's a fantastic actor to begin with, but the minute details in this performance and how chilling it is to me with how little he's doing is really incredible. So I highlighted that in a video, and then I think I also talked about its cinematography recently as well, which is kind of similar, and I'll probably mention this multiple times, but really to me, one of the things I love so much about this movie is sort of the subtlety with which it's doing. The cinematography is the kind of thing where you could watch this once and not notice anything that particularly special about it. There's some longer takes or like a few shots that are composed in a really interesting way that might stand out to you. But mostly it's just kind of there, and you're like, okay, it's good, it's serviceable.
It's not in your face about it.
Yeah, it's not in your face. But this is one of those movies, in the performances, in the cinematography, in how it's written, that just kind of has more to discover, or there's a lot to discover there as I've rewatched it. And every time I've rewatched it, I've kind of seen more of what it's doing, which for someone like me is fun to find, because part of what we do is kind of take a movie and watch it a bunch of times, or like break it apart into pieces. And so I love a movie that has a lot there to discover once you start doing that. But I think there's maybe an interesting discussion to be had about if there's downsides to that, because I think this is also a movie that is really difficult to get like the most out of on a first watch. Like, I think you really have to go in a second time at least, to even in terms of plot and experience, to kind of get the full experience here, or experience everything that this movie has to offer. So I think there's upsides and downsides to that, but I've had a lot of fun revisiting it and kind of finding more here, and talking about those little details. I've never put all those things into a video so far, so it'll be fun to kind of talk about it holistically here, and I might do a video eventually, we'll see. But this is one that I like as a story, but also as a movie to examine and dissect from a filmmaking perspective, because I think there's a lot it rewards doing that. I guess if you rewatched it for this would have been your second time. You saw it a while ago.
Yeah. I think I saw it in the year that it came out, the first time at least, and then I rewatched it again for the second time last night. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying. For one, I think the second viewing was much more rewarding, and even though I enjoyed it the first time, I was surprised at how much I had actually forgotten about it.
Yeah.
I don't mean that in a bad way, but it's just, there's a lot of stuff that went over my head. I remembered all the big moments, like the big twists, but I forgot a lot of the subtleties of it.
Right.
And I think a lot of the essence of this movie is hidden in those subtleties. So in a way, the second viewing was more refreshing than usual, even because I had lost out on so many details the first time around. And even now, the second time, I was still, for someone who analyzes movies for a living, I still felt kind of like it went over my head, and only later I was like, oh wait, so that what's going on. I completely forgot about the whole potential murder aspect to it all.
Right.
Because I remembered I was watching the movie, I think like 20-30 minutes, and I was thinking like, I remember reading the IMDb description where it says like, we have this young guy, Jung-soo, I think his name was, who meets this girl and she goes on a trip. He falls in love with her, but at first it seems like she is attracted to him, but she also wants him to watch over her cat while she's away. She goes on this trip to Africa, and then she comes back with this enigmatic young guy, or slightly older than Jung-soo is, but still relatively young and very wealthy guy, played by Stephen Yeun. The IMDb description says that, and then that at some point Stephen Young shares, his character is named Ben. Ben shares with him a mysterious like hobby or unusual hobby that he has.
Yeah.
I remembered that before I went into the movie, and then like 20-30 minutes in, I was thinking to myself, like, I didn't remember what the hobby was.
Right.
So I was like, what was this about again? And then it took even longer to realize, like, oh wait, this is actually a metaphor. It's not a literal hobby, like probably not, at least.
That's kind of one of the central questions is this is based on a short story, or there's two short stories. There's one by William Faulkner, and Faulkner's writing is referenced directly in the movie, called Barn Burning. I actually haven't read this short story, but there's also a Haruki Murakami, I think is how you say his name. The author wrote a short story also called Barn Burning. That's kind of what this is most directly based on. And that short story, it's only 14 pages. All that's in that story essentially is like the basic setup, which is different. Like Jung-soo is like an older married guy, and he's hanging out with this young woman. And then this other character starts hanging around, and they have the conversation about the barn burning, and then the girl disappears, and then the story ends. There's it doesn't elaborate really beyond that. So it's just left in the mind of the character, the Jung-soo character in the short story. He runs around and he looks for the barns, but he never finds one that's burned down. And then so he's just kind of like, oh, that's weird, and the story ends there. So it's just left completely ambiguous. It doesn't even connect them to the extent that this movie does. And the movie adds a lot more layers of kind of like unfolding that mystery and digging into whether or not Ben actually has a hobby of serially murdering young women that he's talking about in this metaphor of burning these greenhouses. It digs into that mystery a little bit more, but it still leaves it relatively ambiguous. And I think that ambiguity, how ambiguous that is I think apparent in the fact that you forgot about that whole plot like after watching it one time, because it never explicitly comes out and says any of that. Like Jung-soo never talks to anyone about the fact that he seems to think that Ben like killed Hae-mi. It's like he says almost nothing. So you're left as the viewer to kind of put the pieces together in the same way that he is, and you never get anything beyond just like circumstantial evidence. So there's a lot of ambiguity in that, but we can get to that more later. Maybe we should start more at the beginning, because another thing about this movie is that it is that makes it, I think, weird to watch in this dynamic of the second watch being more fulfilling maybe than the first, is it is truly like a slow burn, pun maybe intended, in that like it's like 20 minutes before we even go to Jung-soo's house. Like Stephen Yeun, the Ben character, shows up like 40 minutes into the movie. The real mystery portion of the movie, where Jung-soo is like following Ben around and kind of like trying to figure out what happened, is only like the last like hour at most.
Yeah. It's a 2.5 hour movie.
So there's a whole like hour and a half of movie at the beginning that's just kind of like this lonely young man who doesn't have a whole lot going on, meeting up with this, he happens to meet up with Hae-mi, who he knew from childhood, and they're just kind of hanging out, and she's telling him weird stories and doing pantomime stuff, and they have sex, and Jung-soo shovels cow poop. It's like there's not much going on. It's just
Yeah.
it's just like establishing this setting and these characters for basically an hour before really anything starts happening. And so the first time you watch that,
Yeah.
I think like you pick up on the mood, you pick up on some of these things, and once the three of them start hanging out together, even Steven Yeun, you're like, oh, maybe he's a little weird or haughty, or he's being classist a little bit, but there's a little bit arrogant, but there's not a lot of like weight and meaning in those moments necessarily, or there's not as much as there is on a second watch where the context of kind of what happened or what happens at the end of the movie. Suddenly you're like reading into all these little details and you're trying to figure out like, okay, is he a murderer or is he just like a haughty rich kid? There's a lot of different things that the characters say. Like one example is Hey Me, I think it's pretty early on, she mentions something about like wanting to disappear, just wanting to like, I think it's after she comes back from the trip. She's like, I wish I could just disappear as if I never existed. And the first time you hear that, you're like, oh, that's kind of like just a sad sentiment for the character to say. But then when the second time you watch that, it suddenly takes on more significance. Is that like, does that point to her just disappearing on her own and Ben having nothing to do with it? We don't know.
Yeah. It might also be like if you do go with the interpretation that Ben is a serial killer, that might have been a sign of her displaying herself as prey to him, because he specifically searches out these quote-unquote abandoned greenhouses that are no longer being used. And so Ben does mention to Jung-soo at some point that she is someone who isn't in contact with her family, doesn't have many friends, doesn't have much going on. So she is, in this metaphor, the abandoned greenhouse that no one will truly miss if it's burned down without a trace, except for Jung-soo, I guess. And that, I guess, is also the main tension there towards the end. But yeah, I think it's also very much, especially in that first half, a story of loneliness and disconnection. Maybe, they talk about the search for meaning as the little hunger versus the great hunger. Right. With the little hunger, I think, being the more basic essentials for survival, and then the great hunger, the really important one, is more the quest for meaning, which is, I think, what drove Haimi to Africa in the first place. She was hoping to find or to fulfill that great hunger there, even though she comes back with mixed success, I guess. And also, you mentioned Murakami.
Murakami, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't read the short story that this movie is based on, but I am familiar with some of his other works, and I definitely recognized some of those storytelling elements here. There's always, especially with like Kafka on the Shore, there's a kind of a Freudian angle to it all, and you can sort of see it here. There's a sexual tension, and also sex is clearly a part of the thing that drives desires and is also used or wielded as power.
Right.
In like these little insignificant ways almost.
Yeah.
Especially in early on, you get the sense that when Haimi first meets Jung-soo, he doesn't remember her, but she remembers him. But she remembers him mostly in a negative way because he apparently told her once that she was ugly, and now she says like, I got plastic surgery, I'm pretty now. So when she sleeps with him, there's it doesn't feel like a pure I'm attracted to you and I want this. It feels like there's other motives or other sentiments coming into that area. And then again, when after that, she's like, okay, I'm going to Africa now, I need someone to watch over my cat, and she doesn't appear to have anyone else. So to what extent was she playing his strings or trying to pull his strings and trying to manufacture a situation for which she used sex as a sort of power tool, I guess. I'm not sure what the best way to describe that is.
Right. But we definitely don't get the feeling that, I definitely don't get the feeling watching it that she's just like attracted to Jung-soo and is interested in having a relationship with him. There seems to be like, you put it perfectly when you said it doesn't feel like there's kind of their relationship doesn't feel like it has a basis in this kind of in love, I guess would be the easiest way of saying it. You know, it just feels very like Jung-soo desires a lot of things. Sex is just one of them. And like, it doesn't feel like he even wants Hae-mi specifically. He sees her as like kind of an object to that he can get that by, I think. Although he does like confess his love later, but only to Ben.
I think he thinks he loves her, but he is also, he does kind of capture that misogynist nice guy who will idolize a woman and put her on a pedestal, but then the moment she, you know, after that, when she does that topless dance, she's like, or he's like, oh, why do you take your clothes off so easily? Like then he pushes her down, and I think he even calls her a whore or something like that, which is that typical kind of, you idolize, or you come across as the perfect nice guy who idealizes women, but then when they want to express themselves, or especially their sexuality, they suddenly become more possessive or restrictive, as if the sexuality of a woman is a thing for them to possess and not something for the women themselves to express.
Right.
But I think the irony here is that after Hae-mi comes back with Ben, it's kind of suggested that they are together now. It's never explicit, and they don't say it out loud, but you know, there's that moment early when they get back from the airport, and then Jung-soo does have a chance to bring Hae-mi home, but then he's immediately like, or I think Ben offers like, should I take you home? And Jung-soo, instead of like resisting, or at least maybe demonstrating indirectly like, I kind of want to spend some time with her, like he immediately picks the bag or her bag out of his truck, puts it in Ben's car, and pretty much surrenders her immediately. And then later there's that moment where he insults her for taking off her clothes in a public setting, even though there's pretty much no one around. But the irony there, I think, is that even though over time their relation is one that's now divorced from a sexual relation or from sexual intercourse or any romantic involvement, basically, it does feel like that's when Hae-mi, or at least that's what Ben says later on, is that's when Hae-mi does come to realize that he is actually someone she may have wanted to be with, even though she felt like maybe rejected by him to some degree. But I don't know. I like that there's so many complicated layers to their relation, and that it really shows that attraction and love and kind of that whole area of human connection is so complicated and dynamic also. And it's just a really fascinating part of this film for me, because I think because you identify so much with Jung-soo, he's the point of view character, you're kind of guessing at Hae-mi's inner psychology and what's really going on inside of her. And so you basically only have Ben's testimony at some point after she's disappeared. I think he tells Ben that, or he tells Jung-soo that she genuinely cared for him, and so that Ben even was jealous of him for Hae-mi feeling this way about Jung-soo. So I don't know. I think this also, I think, plays into the Ben is not a serial killer interpretation of the story, or maybe that Hae-mi has just disappeared, and that in the sense that she came home from the trip with this new eccentric guy, and maybe she came to realize that he's not all that either.
Right.
And so she realizes maybe she wants to be with Jung-soo, someone nice, but then he turns out to be not that nice, and he's actually pushing her away, it seems, and not letting her be who she wants to be. And so she kind of feels abandoned.
Yeah.
And that's when she decides to disappear. And that's also what makes that interpretation slightly more likely.
Yes.
But,
Yeah, I agree that there's definitely illusion there. And I think there's an interesting dynamic where the sort of love triangle that forms between them, class kind of plays a big role in that, where there's this implication that, or not even implication, we find out later that Hae-mi has all this credit card debt. Class is a big theme throughout the film. I think a lot of the way it's set up structurally is we spend all this time at the beginning kind of in Jung-soo's environment, in the places that he and Hae-mi are hanging out. There's this great moment where they walk into her apartment and the camera's just facing the door, and Jung-soo is like, comments on how nice of an apartment it is, and then the camera just kind of slowly pans over, and it's like, at least to my American eyes, it's like the tiniest apartment imaginable. But he's commenting on like how the apartment he had in Seoul, I guess it was even smaller than hers.
Might also have been just politeness.
Right, yes, it could have been. But there's this dynamic where I feel like what Jung-soo wants is not Hae-mi, but to be Ben, because in his mind, Ben can just get Hae-mi or any other girl that he wants. He just has all these other things that Jung-soo wants. So there's this like, the object of Jung-soo's desire is not necessarily Hae-mi, although maybe he thinks it does. Or maybe even there is a spark of something real between them, but that then gets overshadowed by this desire to be Ben or have what Ben has or these other things.
Yeah. I think it may also just have been this sort of internalized submission towards higher class, which in this case is the higher financial class also equals to higher social class and higher, like maybe even like higher, like a higher tier of masculinity that he automatically has to bow down to because he feels like he's not in that same league of men. And so that's maybe why he immediately almost hands Hae-mi over to him without even so much of a protest or because the class structure is so strong and so internalized that he automatically puts himself beneath him, also on a more personality level, that just because he is wealthy, more upper class, he's also automatically a better or more deserving human being than he is. And besides him being Ben being more wealthy, he's also being portrayed as being more intelligent. I think he, at least there's a bit of a condescending moment there where he doesn't want to explain what he does for a living, but because he says or Jung-soo won't understand it anyways. And he's also kind of condescending towards Hae-mi, where to the point where you start questioning, what does Ben even want from her?
Right. Because
they don't seem to have anything like intelligent really to talk about, at least not from Ben's perspective. And so that, I guess that again plays into the interpretation that he might have actually just been spending time with her as a serial killer looking for his next victim.
Yeah. It's definitely portrayed. Ben is an interesting character here because, like I already mentioned, I think the performance is amazing. There's a lot of these little moments where Ben kind of does something that on paper you could kind of describe as fairly innocent, but the way it's played or the way it plays out in the movie feels specifically malicious. Like there's that moment where they meet up. Ben kind of invites Hae-mi and Jung-soo to come have dinner with his rich friends, is kind of the subtext. And they all walk up. He introduces Jung-soo as a writer, and then they ask what he's writing, and he's like, oh, well, I'm not published yet. And then Ben kind of defends him, quote unquote, where he's like, oh, to be a writer is just to write. He's kind of like, but the friend's reaction to that is like laughter, and you can tell they don't take him seriously. The way Ben is presenting that moment to me feels very much like he is saying Jung-soo is a writer to his friends with a little bit of a wink and a nod, and he's playing with the power dynamic that he has of someone of higher socioeconomic status, and using that power to kind of treat them as playthings. And we see that a lot where there's this, at that same dinner, then Hae-mi is kind of telling her stories from Africa, and she gets up and dances. And this is a moment I talked about in my subtle performances video, but there's this little moment where she's dancing because everybody's encouraged her to, and everybody kind of loses interest. And there's almost this like feeling of embarrassment that falls across the wealthier
Yeah.
people. And Jung-soo catches Ben yawning, and then like Ben sees that Jung-soo sees him yawning and kind of gives him this kind of like knowing smile almost, which really comes across as sick in a kind of way, where he's like, he just is so, there's such an air of not just arrogance and haughtiness there, but then also like complete, I don't know. He sees himself as so above it that he's just like wielding Hey Me as this like fun little trinket that he can kind of like parade around to his wealthy friends. And that scene is weird, and you're kind of like, ooh, I get really bad vibes from this guy. When you see that play out the second time, once Jung-soo is like suspicious that he might have murdered Hey Mi, like, and you see there's a new girl that is also telling her stories of her travels, and like this whole sequence seems to be playing out again in a second scene, and again we catch Ben like yawning in the same way. It's like it goes from like, okay, bad creepy arrogant vibes to just like, this guy's sick. I was trying to read some Korean reviews of this, and so I was it was a little difficult because I was finding them in Korean and then trying to Google translate them into English, which is not the most accurate way of doing things. But I came across one review where the person said something to the effect of, whether or not he killed Hey Mi is kind of beside the point. Like, I mean, it's an interesting question within the film, but either way, the like his character is kind of sick in a certain way, or seems almost psychopathic in a certain way. Regardless of that, he's still like leveraging his power in a way to just like play these, treat these people as his kind of like playthings. And I thought that was a great point, that like his character, there's a degree of difference between he's a serial killer and he's just this guy who picks up these women and then tosses them out, but like
kind of objectifies them and plays around with them, and then
tosses them aside. But like the greenhouse metaphor kind of stands either way. Like the burning of the greenhouse metaphor stands either way. He may not be killing them, but he's still just like finding these vulnerable women and then just like, using them up and burning them.
Yeah. Even if you take the burning of the greenhouses literally instead of metaphorically, even there's already that same dynamic where he kind of goes into the countryside for his own strange little hobby. And then there's this whole conversation about how he decides, or with Jung-soo, how he decides which greenhouses are truly abandoned and
right
waiting to be burned by him. And he kind of gives this almost like he is like it's sort of law of nature, the way he decides, like this this has to happen. Like he doesn't even feel strongly motivated, or he just seems to say like he is God, and whatever happens is whatever I do is whatever happens, and it's just, that's the way it is, that's how it goes, or something like that. He doesn't seem to really give a good explanation for how he picks them, and that, I guess, is the arrogance, that he just looks upon a landscape and he sees like the things that he can take or use for himself, and without regard for maybe this is someone's property, or this is being used by some farmer that he in some way that he doesn't recognize. He doesn't even seem to consider that there may be other people with other perspectives on this, or he just kind of assumes that whatever he wants is how it has to be, or how it is.
Yeah. There's another moment where they go and make pasta, where he talks about making food, and he likes making food for himself because he makes it as an offering, in the same way that people made an offering to gods. He makes food for himself and then eats it. So it's like he's definitely equating himself with God in a way that's very creepy, at the least. This episode of Cinema of Meaning is brought to you by MUBI. MUBI is an online streaming cinema with hand-curated movies from all around the world. They carry Burning in the US, which is the movie we're talking about today. I've recommended it already a bunch of times. I love this movie, and I love MUBI. So if you don't have MUBI yet, you can sign up and give Burning a watch on there if you haven't seen it yet, or if you need to watch it a second time now that we've talked about it, which I definitely recommend.
Yeah, other than that, they also have Decision to Leave that's streaming worldwide. I come back to that one later in the towards the end of the episode, which is also a fantastic Korean mystery thriller / romance, which is exclusively available on MUBI. So that's another great watch within their already amazing library.
You can check that library out when you sign up for an extended 30-day free trial at mubi.com/cinema of meaning. They're adding new films all the time, and everyone is handpicked with a description of why they chose that movie to include. So beyond our recommendations, MUBI's just a great resource for exploring cinema and kind of finding new and interesting things to watch on their streaming service. So again, sign up for your extended 30-day free trial at mubi.com/cinema of meaning. Thanks so much to them for sponsoring this podcast.
I saw a different interpretation. I don't remember where I saw it, but there was one interpretation that argued that whatever we see in the movie up until Haimy's disappearance, but everything that happens after that, that's actually Jung-soo finally having finished his novel.
Right.
And so that's the fiction of his own story. Because as you said, he is a writer, or he's trying to be a writer, but it's not quite working out. He isn't quite able to find his story.
Yeah.
Which is also reflected in the beginning. He's very stuck in his situation, and he has to go to his dad's hearing, who is on trial for violence against a
police officer, person. I think.
Yeah. But that it's kind of like stuck in place. It's not progressing anywhere, and that kind of resembles Jung-soo's situation with where he's at with his story. And so, as this interpretation goes, it's because of Ben actually, and maybe Haimi, that he finds the motivation to give his story a direction. And so, we have the quote-unquote real story where he does meet Ben, who is this Great Gatsby-ish character, kind of strange, eccentric, arrogant, classist, all those things, but not necessarily a serial killer. And then Haimi at some point just grabs her stuff and moves and disappears to start life anew. And that's what Jung-soo then uses as the building blocks to base his story on, and he changes it into explicit murder mystery / thriller story, in which he, the point is that there is a division there between what's real, what's imagined, or what's fiction. But either way, Ben came into his life and gave him some kind of inspiration or some kind of catharsis, I guess, some kind of way to break his rut that he was in.
Right.
And either way, whether Ben actually was a serial killer or not, he still was this kind of villainous character who treated Haimi and maybe Jung-soo to a lesser extent symbolically the same as a serial killer would treat his murder victims.
Right.
Kind of that objectifying, disconnecting from their humanity and just doing whatever he wants with them without regard for what it is that they want.
Yeah. There's a very specific moment for me that I think that break happens, if that's something that happens in the film. There's a scene towards the end where Jung-soo seems to fantasize that they're having sex again, but then he's just laying in her apartment by himself, and then he starts writing, and the camera pulls back from the window and we see him writing in the window. And it's the first time, I'm pretty sure, I've seen this movie a bunch of times now and I've taken pretty extensive notes. I'm pretty sure this is the first moment in the film where we actually break from Jung-soo's perspective. We see every scene that happens in the movie, he's present in the scene or he's there in some way. We don't find out any information that he doesn't know. And then we get the scene of him writing, and this is after he found that Ben seems to have Haimi's cat. He's writing, and then it pulls back, and then we cut to Ben by himself with this new girl, and he's putting makeup on her, and he seems to be kind of preparing. And then while that's happening, he gets a phone call, and then he goes to meet up with Jung-soo, and then we get this climactic ending moment where Jung-soo stabs him, burns the car. And I think there's a strong insinuation that all of that maybe the stuff before that actually happened, where he follows Ben around. He is actually suspicious, but then he is unable to actually do anything about any of it, about his suspicions, and he just writes this ending where he goes and kills Ben in vengeance.
Yeah.
And so I think that might be the break, or that's the break in my mind, where I think we likely veer into Jung-soo's novel.
I think the interpretation I saw had it break earlier, probably after that dance scene that also goes on and kind of turns a little bit dreamy.
Right.
Because I think that was the last moment we see Hey Me on screen, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I think after that she's disappeared.
Yeah. The fact that he's a writer and that we kind of see him writing the story at the end introduces this sort of element of him potentially being an unreliable narrator, and that could start anywhere. The whole thing could be the story. It's hard to tell, but I think my feeling is that there's such a sharp stylistic break in those last couple scenes that I think that's probably the insinuation. Yeah. There's another interesting moment. The one so he's been following Ben around for a while, and he doesn't really have any evidence. He finds the watch in the bathroom, which could have just been maybe she just left it there before she took off.
Or gifted it to him.
Him. Who knows? We see he seems to have Boyle the cat, but Boyle as a cat is a weird character anyway, because he's half imaginary. That's maybe one of the more Murakami-esque elements of the story is there's this cat that seems to simultaneously exist and not exist. But anyway, Ben, he does leave poop, but doesn't show up. And then later he shows up and responds to the name Boyle. But again, Ben could have just taken him from Haimi and be lying about it. The cat could have just responded to coincidentally to that name. It's who knows? That doesn't prove anything. And then the weirdest piece, besides the whole greenhouse story, which could be just you can easily read as Ben kind of through metaphor admitting to this whole thing. When he goes up, he's following Ben around, and they go up to a quarry in a more rural area. He's just looking out over this quarry, which you could assume would be, probably an easy place to hide a body or something like that. But that whole sequence, I'm not even sure if it's not a dream to some extent, because he there's this weird cut where he's standing up on the hill, and you feel something would be about to happen. There's no, it just has this very weird sense, and then immediately it cuts to Jung-soo waking up in the next scene.
Oh yeah.
So I think there's a degree of ambiguity there too, in towards the end, where we're not sure how much, even if it's not his novel, how much of this is his sort of paranoia running amok, and to what degree he's actually kind of doing these things.
Yeah, I think Ben is definitely an unreliable narrator, or maybe even just a pathological liar.
Yes.
He does, even without serial killer stuff, he does seem a bit sociopathic.
He talks literally about never crying.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That was what I was going to say. He doesn't cry, doesn't feel sadness, which is a typical flag to pinpoint, I think, sociopathy. But then again, Haimi also doesn't feel like the most reliable narrator. As you know, you talked about the cat that may be hidden somewhere but doesn't want to come out. And
then you get the well.
Yeah, the story of the well, which is again... there's a lot of multiple moments where she brings up memories that Jung-soo was apparently present for when they were young, but that Jung-soo doesn't remember, like
Right.
him calling her ugly, him seeing her fall down the well that may or may have not even existed. So yeah, there's a lot of, the movie does infuse the story with a lot of ambiguity that inevitably prompts you to question what is real and what is not. I'm usually not the biggest fan of stories that pose that question, or that leave you with that question, like, oh, what was real, what was fiction,
Right.
what was
Yeah.
imagined,
Yeah.
was it all a dream or was it real? Like, that to me is not the interesting question. I think I always see it more as a vehicle to dig behind, like, the sort of dynamics that are true regardless of the interpretation. And I
Right.
think that's what gets us back to Ben being this villainous character. I think that's I kind of just wanted to throw that out there as a way to explain how I think it's best to approach these
Yes.
stories.
Yes.
And it's interesting to talk about, like, oh, was he really a serial killer? You know, look at all the little hints. Like, he had even quite early on, the first time they were at this apartment, there's this kind of a women's bathroom item box
Yeah. It's like a
that he doesn't
makeup
seem to have any use for.
makeup
Yeah,
box.
like
Yeah.
makeup and stuff, which already is suspicious or strange. And there's other, like, hints sprinkled throughout that may suggest that Ben is actually a serial killer, and the way that he obviously talks about or talks to Jung-soo about, like, I burned down a greenhouse
Right.
near you, and then Jung-soo is like, I checked upon all of them. That's not any one of them.
Yeah.
How strange, you know. And then he says, like, oh, what? It's very, you might be
Yeah.
too close to see it. And
Yeah.
and that's, of course, when Hey-mi has already disappeared out of his life, even though at that point, I think, is not yet aware that she's actually disappeared.
Right.
So yeah, there's little hints like that. There's other hints that he may just be a regular guy, or at least not a serial killer.
Right.
But yeah, I think it's important, just as a general note, that you should not, or at least that it's, if you want to get the most out of a movie like this, then you should not have that be the end point of a discussion, but rather the
Yes.
beginning. Like,
Right.
what do these different metaphorical lanes really reveal because usually there still is a more unifying story
Yes.
beneath there that's true regardless of which angle you look at it from.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I think I should clarify. I think you're totally right, and I think one of the things that I like about this movie is it doesn't feel like rewatch the multiple times I've rewatched it. There's more there's more depth that unfolds, but I'm not, each time I've watched it, it's not like, ooh, I'm noticing more clues about the truth and I'm getting to the bottom of the mystery.
Yeah.
It's not really that, and there's a lot of ambiguity throughout the film that doesn't really have anything to do with the question of whether or not Ben is the serial killer or not too, which I think speaks to this, like, broader question of the ambiguity of life, or the mystery of life in certain ways. And you know, this particular question is just kind of like one of those. Jung-soo talks at one point, Ben asks him what kind of story he's writing, and Jung-soo says something like, you know, to me, life is a mystery. This is where I think it's a great adaptation of Murakami in a way. Like,
Yeah.
this movie feels a lot more Murakami to me than Drive My Car does, in that there's this, like, you already mentioned Kafka on the Shore, but in that book, there's this palpable sense of all this ambiguity and mystery, but you also get a really strong sense that you could read that book like 5 times and never get to the bottom of what's actually going on there. It's kind of, there's kind of this sense of unresolvable question baked into the thing itself. And there's a sort of like poetry to, like, the way things are happening that also feels kind of it's hard to describe, but it's much more about getting into that feeling and that experience of how those things come across as you're watching this movie than it is like answering any of those specific questions, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it does a great job at infusing that mystery of life into the mystery of other people, in the sense that to Jung-soo, both Hae-mi and Ben are to some extent impenetrable. That in the sense that he doesn't seem to get like a true grasp on both of their characters, and so
Yeah.
maybe that's why he uses fiction as a way or as a means to find some sort of closure or resolve it in some way or another. But yeah, I
Yeah.
think either way, I think whether Hae-mi is killed or not, I think in both cases she is a kind of tragic, lost soul type of character who keeps running into walls with whatever she tries to do to satisfy that. I guess both her great and her little hunger, if she's also in a lot of debt and not really having any career or
Yeah.
life path in front of her. And the same with Ben. We talked about this already, but regardless of how you look at him, he still is a kind of a high class, objectifying person, maybe slightly sociopathic, but there's in both cases there's at least to Jung-soo, this is what he can draw from them, but there still is that essence that's missing for us to decide which one it is. Is Hae-mi just gone, or is she killed? Is Ben just an arrogant douchebag, or is he really that psychopathic
Right.
serial killer?
Yeah.
It's easy to miss how hard I think it is to pull that off in a story, because usually I think when ambiguity fails is when multiple interpretations also change the meaning of the story significantly.
Right.
You can get a sense of these characters, but there's still, you can never get a full sense of them. And I think no matter how you look at them, you still get some of the same elements, but at the same time, you never get the full picture. And I think that's part of what this movie is about thematically, about kind of making your way through a world where where everyone around you is to some extent ambiguous and mysterious and out of reach.
Right.
But
yeah.
at the same time, I guess if there's any solace, there's enough there to build some kind of unifying narrative about them, or to find closure, at least in your own imagination of that can be used to sort of fill in the gaps.
Right. I also want to mention the way that this movie in particular is handling kind of class and economic disparity. I think, Parasite is a movie that I've talked a lot about on my channel, and is, for probably most people, the South Korean cinema, examination of class that is most well recognized or popular. But I think this movie hits on a certain kind of nuance in that discussion that I think even Parasite doesn't really have. And it's relating the economic disparity like really clearly to Hae-mi's vulnerability in a lot of ways. When Jung-soo is trying to track her down, he goes to like where she used to work, and he talks to this woman, and she's kind of like, all these women are transient. They're just trying to make a buck where they can. She says this thing about no country for women. There's this implication that part of why she's with Ben is because she might need money and he has it. So she's having to rely on wealthier men for money. Then he goes to her family, and we find out that the reason she's estranged from her family is because of these credit card debts. And so it's like kind of this whole thing that even allows her to be, or the thing that's making her vulnerable in this way and making it so that nobody really cares about what happens to her ultimately, is because of this economic hardship that she's in. And then that's connected to Jung-soo's mother, who he's been estranged from, whose clothes he's had to burn. She shows up for one scene, sees him for the first time in 16 years, basically to ask for money, essentially. We see, I've already talked about how I think Jung-soo in a large way desires to have Ben's sort of status, in part that's provided by his wealth. And there's just a very clear disparity there that's visualized. But one of the things I think this movie does really well, besides just like illustrate that gap and show like the hardship that some of the poorer people are going through, and be like, oh, look, this rich guy is a bad guy, nasty, bad person. it's not just doing that, it's also showing, because I think like one of the downsides in our society, in a lot of societies that have a lot of economic disparity like this, like South Korea or America, is not just that, oh, look, these, poorer people are worse off and have all these things that they have to deal with because of that. That's an unfortunate negative downside. But these situations also tend to create this massive overemphasis where your singular focus in life can often become just like getting out of that place or achieving and wanting more and more and having all this stuff. Like the wealth itself becomes objectified in a way that can kind of like create this like Jung-soo to me is a character that really embodies this sense of like, he's not like the good guy to Ben's sociopathic rich guy. He's kind of like the he's the flip side of a negative coin, both of which are in part created by like the economic disparity of their situation. You have Ben's complete disillusionment with life and boredom that is created by having anything and everything that he could ever want, except for, apparently a woman who trusts in him, because that's the only thing that makes him jealous, he says. But then you have like Jung-soo on the other side of that, who is just consumed entirely by his desire to have those things, to have what he doesn't have. And that rules his life. They both create disconnection. They both keep those characters from truly connecting with Hae-mi. Like all three characters are disconnected because of these things. I don't know. Yeah, I think just like the way it unfolds, all of that, I think has a lot of nuance beyond just saying like, look, rich guy bad, poor guy is bad off because they don't have money or something like that.
Yeah. I think that also adds an interesting weight to the different interpretations, because whereas if you go with Ben as the serial killer, then you can see sort of Hae-mi being victimized by him or being uprooted from her life because of Ben. But if you then look at that negative, or the other side of that negative coin, where she is just, where Ben is not a serial killer, but then it may have been Jung-soo who was, because he was so cruel to her, and even though he was the only person that she trusted, that in that interpretation, it's he who ends up being the deciding factor in why she disappears.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Then you have to, if you're in both cases, Hae-mi disappears, but no matter, like if you look at the different angles of those or the different sides of that negative coin, there's different people to blame or different factors to blame, I guess.
Right.
Not saying that Hae-mi is just the a sort of reactionary figure who's just tossed around by the men in her life, but it does, I think, if you take her as a character who is lost and in search for meaning, and she's in debt, so she doesn't have anywhere else to go, no ties to this world, and then you can kind of see how either, someone who objectifies her like Ben does and then treats her like crap kind of pushes her over the edge. But at the same time, if she does meet the guy or put her trust in the guy she sees as the nice guy, and then he ends up treating her as also in the kind of that nice guy objectifying way, where he did the idealization and at the same time the restricting of freedom and the kind of shaming of her womanhood, I guess. Then you can see that in that case it's he who would also kind of push her over that edge. But
one of the things that occurred to me this watch that I hadn't really thought about before is that I think there might be some kind of there's some kind of division between the characters in terms of how it relates to this little hunger, big hunger dynamic. Hae-mi talks about how the little hunger in the dance starts out down here, and then the hands go upward and it turns into big hunger. And I was just thinking about that in relation to Jung-soo and Hae-mi, and how they both, as characters in the story, are encountering something much closer to little hunger, and they both have this search for meaning Jung-soo is treating life, or life is appearing to him as kind of this mystery that he's unable to solve. And Hae-mi is also desperately trying to find this kind of meaning. And then on the flip side of that, you have Ben, who does not have little hunger and also seems not really to have big hunger. He is not searching for meaning because to him, life has become meaningless. And, you know, he seems to exist in a state of a sort of total, you know, like nihilism, where he says there is no right and wrong. There, you know, he treats everything as kind of a plaything, with no meaning. So I think, you know, there's some kind of, I don't know if that's true about life. Like if little hunger actually does beget big hunger, I think you probably can get big hunger even with your stomach full of food. But I think there's something there that is trying to be reflected in the story potentially that I think is interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely a movie that's very dense with information, meaning, all the stuff that makes it really worth to rewatch it.
Yeah.
I was just curious, might be an interesting thing to end the episode on, is what other movie would you recommend to people who watched Burning and enjoyed it and are now looking for something similar or something that deals with similar themes? Like, what's the best movie to watch after this one?
Okay, good question. And I have some recommendations. And this might go in a direction that people aren't expecting. But one of the things I really love about Burning is that I think, to me, it captures a lot of the elements of noir and neo-noir films that I really love. A lot of classic, I really love, especially neo-noirs, and this sense of mystery, this sense of someone trying to solve a mystery who's not really that equipped to solve it, or is kind of, you know, you think about characters like the dude in The Big Lebowski, where they're just kind of like bumbling around and sort of, you know, accidentally solving this mystery. You know, it's like Jung-soo kind of takes on that persona in the second half of this film. So the movies that I really think about in relationship to this one are actually maybe Paul Thomas Anderson's Inherent Vice, which is also a movie for me that if you rewatch it a couple times, there's like depth there, and there's mystery that doesn't, like, it in some of the other detective mysteries, the mystery actually gets solved, but there's still this pervasive sense of like not exactly knowing what's going on, and what's more important in the story is not necessarily the mystery that's being solved. It's more about the dynamic between the characters as you're on the path to solve that mystery. So I'd recommend that one. And then also The Long Goodbye is a movie that I really love that has some kind of similarities to this, where it's a detective. It's Marlowe, played by Elliot Gould, and a great movie. Maybe this is one we could talk about sometime because I love it. And he's dealing with the fact that a close friend of his is suspected of murdering his girlfriend or wife. I forget who it is. And so he's kind of trying to solve this case, but it has this very personal element attached to it. So those would be my recommendations. They maybe don't hit the same like themes exactly, but they have the same quality of sort of like mystery and ambiguity and having to make a choice about what to do based on incomplete information or that kind of thing.
Yeah, interesting choice and unexpected ones. I think mine now feels much more on the nose, but
well, that's good. It'll balance it out.
The one that I was thinking of was last year's Decision to Leave.
Oh yes,
which is also on MUBI right now.
Yes,
that also felt like, let me put it like this: like after watching Burning, I immediately wanted to rewatch Decision to Leave because I felt like I still haven't gone back to that movie for a second viewing, but I felt like that was also a movie that was so dense with little details and nuances that make a second viewing so rewarding.
Yeah.
You know, I think that's probably then in a movie that feels very similar in vibe as well, a kind of neo-noir-ish, romance-driven thriller set in Korea, South Korea, that also deals with similar themes of people being driven by emotions that they do not fully understand themselves,
Yes.
and people trying to connect with people that they cannot fully get a grasp of. And yeah, just a very similar and fantastic atmosphere that I think is present in both of those movies.
Good recommendation.
Well, thank you all for listening. If you enjoy the show and want to help us keep it going, be sure to follow us on our creator-owned streaming service, Nebula. Cinema of Meaning is a Nebula original show, meaning that here you can experience our podcast ad-free, listen to all of our episodes a week early, and get instant access to all of our monthly bonus episodes. Last month we talked about the quest for meaning, masculinity, and heroic leaders in David Fincher's Fight Club. But before that we've also covered Babylon, Avatar: The Way of Water, the new All Quiet on the Western Front, Drive, and many others. So you're really getting a whole new catalog of episodes. You can sign up directly at our Nebula page, that's nebula.tv/cinema of meaning, or just follow the link in the show notes. And we'll see you again next time.